Racial Discrimination in America by Michaela Gothers. Race is an important social issue because people use racial differences as the basis for discrimination. Much of today's racism can be traced to the era of colonialism that began in the 1400s. When Europeans began colonizing Africa and the Americas, the white settlers adopted the idea that they were superior to other races they encountered, and it was their job to civilize the savages. This false concept became known as the white man's burden and was used to justify the Europeans taking land and enslaving people. In this way, naturally occurring racial differences became the basis for systems of exploitation and discrimination. Racism is the logical practice of denying people's access to rights, representations, or resources based on racial differences. Institutionalized racism is a thorough system of discrimination that involves social institutions and affects virtually every aspect of society. It's important to remember that racism is neither natural nor inevitable. Through history, people of different racial groups have interacted and coexisted peacefully. During the Middle Ages, for example, Europeans looked up to the people of Africa and China, whose civilization and culture were considered to be more advanced. These ideas changed significantly during the colonial era. People from other countries who have came to America get racial comments all the time from Americans. It was popular back in the 1400s all the way up until today's time period. It is a big problem that a lot of people want to go away, but it's not going to. Different racial groups that experience all of this are Native Americans, African Americans, Latin Americans, Middle Easterners and Muslims, and Asian Americans. Millions of Native Americans occupied the area now called the United States prior to the colonial era. In an effort to obtain much of the North America territory, a long series of wars, massacres, forced displacements, restriction of food rights, and the imposition of treaties, land was taken and numerous hardships were imposed. Ideologies justify the context included stereotypes of Native Americans as merciless Indian savages. To this day, Native Americans are the most harshly affected in institutionalized racism. Slavery in the United States began soon after English colonists first settled Virginia and lasted until the passage of the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution in 1865. By the 18th century, court ruling established racial basis of the American version of slavery to apply chiefly to Black Africans and people of African descent, and occasionally to Native Americans. The 19th century saw a hardening of institutionalized racism and legal discrimination against citizens of African descent in the United States. Racism in the United States was worse during this time than any other period before it, since segregation, racial discrimination, or expressions of white supremacy all increased. So did anti-Black violence, including race riots. While substantial gains were made in succeeding decades through middle-class advancement in public employment, Black poverty and education inequalities have depended in the post-industrial era. It's not as bad as these days as it was earlier in earlier eras, but we still see discrimination against African Americans today. Americans of Latin America ancestry come from a wide variety of racial and ethnic backgrounds, yet other Americans often view Latin Americans as a monolithic group. Latinos are often portrayed as passionate, hypersexual, violent, lazy, or macho in literature, films, television, and music. Recent increases in legal and illegal Hispanic immigration has spurred an anti-Latino response, particularly in areas in the United States that had previously seen few Hispanic immigrants. The immigration debate was generated negative feelings of nativism and racist claims that Latin Americans are taking over while white Anglo-American society, especially the southern western United States, home to most American Latinos. Racism against Arab Americans has risen along the tensions between the American government and the Arab War. Following the September 11, 2001 attacks in the United States, discrimination and racial violence has markedly increased against Arab Americans and many other religious and cultural groups. Iraqis in particular were demonized, which led to hatred towards Arabs and Iranians living in the United States and elsewhere in the Western world. There have been attacks against Arabs not only on the basis of their religion, Islam, but also on the basis of their ethnicity. Numerous Christian Arabs have been attacked based on their appearances. In addition, non-Arabs who were mistaken for Arabs because of perceived similarities in appearance, have been collateral victims of anti-Arabism. Also, Hollywood is guilty of portraying Arabs as villains and terrorists and depicting them stereotypically. In the Pacific States, racism was primarily directed against the resident Asian immigrants. Several immigration laws discriminated against the Asians, and at different points of ethnic Chinese or other groups were banned from entering the U.S. The Chinese were often subjected to harder labor when working on the railroads and were given more dangerous tasks, for example, using dynamite to make pathways through the mountains. Today, Asian Americans are seen as really smart people, and when Americans see them, they automatically think that they're really smart and probably have a good job. They get racial comments about their eyes, for example, the dentist floss joke. They receive many racial comments in the U.S., and it's been like this for a while. The conflict for perspective, pioneered by Karl Marx, saw all forms of inequality subsumed under class conflicts. For Marx, issues related to race and ethnicity were secondary to the class struggle.